This is the word of the Lord. Hosea chapter 11. The heading is God's love for Israel. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. But the more I called Israel, the further they went from me. They sacrificed to the Baals, and they burned incense to images. It was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms. But they did not realize it was I who healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love, and I lifted the yoke from their neck and bent down to feed them. Will they not return to Egypt, and will not Assyria rule over them? Because they refuse to repent. Swords will flash in their cities, will destroy the bars of their gates, and put an end to their plans. My people are determined to turn from me. Even if they call to the Most High, he will by no means exalt them. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? And how can I make you like Zebulun? My heart is changed within me. All my compassion is aroused, and I will not carry out my fierce anger, nor will I turn and devastate Ephraim. For I am God and not man, the Holy One among you. I will not come in wrath. They will follow the Lord. He will roar like a lion. When he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will come trembling like birds from Egypt, like doves from Assyria. I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, the house of Israel with deceit, and Judah is unruly against God, even against the faithful Holy One. Thanks be to God.
Thanks very much, Alison. Well, I don't know, does anybody like art here? Any art kind of lovers? Yeah, a few. I don't know if you've been on an art gallery trip to London. I don't know what your favourite painting is. Most of us have one. What's the most beautiful painting you've ever seen? If Hosea 11 were a painting, I think it would be without doubt the most moving, powerful, exquisite painting. Why? Well, because through his Holy Spirit, God is in this chapter just painting a self-portrait of himself. Or if you want to put it in another way, this is God's selfie. And so far, God has spoken about his people Israel. If you like, he's painted portraits of them, not particularly flattering ones, silly doves, like a morning mist. But now he paints a portrait of himself. And at the end of this chapter, in verse 9, he says this, "For I am God and not a man, the Holy One among you." And you see what he's saying? I want you to know, he says, who I am. I'm not just another man, I'm God, I'm the Holy One. And that's important, because I think often we get a very distorted view of God. I don't know if you saw Jonathan Yeo's portrait of the king recently. I think it was the first one that had been painted of him. Not really my taste, I'll be honest, but I think the king was quite happy with that. Very different to a few years before when Lucian Freud painted Queen Elizabeth II. Somebody said that this painting made her look like a rugby prop forward or even one of her corgis. It's not great, is it? Thankfully, she never lived to see the bronze statues of her and Prince Philip that were put up in Antrim Castle, Northern Ireland. To me, they look less like their majesties and more like Wallace and Gromit. Although I think it has to be said that it could have been a lot worse. The paintings and the statues offer us a very distorted view, don't they, of the people that we know. But Hosea is saying that's what we do with God. You hear people saying things like, I like to think of God as... And we end up doing the same as those artists, don't we? Painting a twisted picture of what God is like. And that's what God says has happened in Israel. Look right at the end of our chapter. Look at verse 12. Ephraim, by the way, Ephraim, Israel, it's just similar words, right? It means the same nation. Ephraim has surrounded me with lies, Israel with deceit, and Judah is unruly against God, even against the faithful Holy One. God's saying, look, I'm giving you a painting of who I am, but all you've done is surround me with lies. And the result is a grotesque view of God. And if you have that, you don't want to follow him. I wonder if anyone's ever said to you, I don't believe in God. If you're a follower of Jesus, somebody says to you, that's interesting, but I don't believe in God. Anyone said that? The best response is this. Rather than having a little bit of an argument, listen to them. Say to them, it's interesting. Tell me about that God that you don't believe in. And listen. And when they finished painting their portrait of God, I think likely as not, you're going to say, do you know what? I don't believe in that God you don't believe in either. Because we all paint false pictures of God. We surround him with lies and deceit. And when we do that, it is much easier to reject him. If your God is a bit mean, a spoil sport, a killjoy, wants you to stop you having fun, invents new rules every day, well, then it becomes much easier to reject him, doesn't it? And instead to follow a God in your own image. If we paint him as a power-hungry dictator, an egomaniac who wants to enslave the world, it's much easier to distrust him and suspect he's out to harm you. If we paint him as uncaring, distant, it's much easier to push him away and look for comforts in gods who seem more immediate, more near. What Israel needed, what we need, is a high-definition, 4K, full brightness, crystal clear view of the real God, the living God. Because if we see who he is, I promise you, we will fall in love with him and we will be faithful to him. So let me just show you 3 features from this portrait, if you like, 3 truths about God that will correct our distorted painting. And here's the first. He is a tender Father. He is the God who draws us close. Have a look at verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him. God's taking his people back to the beginning. When they were just a child, they were a newborn nation. And he says, I loved them. We've got a number of babies in our church family, and I believe the appropriate response to them all is, isn't he cute? Isn't she sweet? I'm working on this right now because currently, as I speak, I'm having a grandchild. So you can pray about that. But that's not the love that God has for Israel. God isn't being swept off his feet because God doesn't love like we love. And thank goodness for that. We often fall in love and then just as soon fall out of love. Love for God isn't primarily a feeling. It's a decision. It's a choice. It flows out the very heart of God because that's what God is. God is love, the Bible tells us. And this love is reliable and solid and faithful. When Israel was a child, God made the decision, I will love that nation. And his love wasn't just words, it was seen in action. Out of Egypt, I called my son, because his people were slaves in Egypt. And so God called to them and brought them out. That's real love. Decisions, actions. not just feelings and passions. And maybe that's a help to you right now. Is there someone you're struggling to love? Perhaps it seems like the magic's gone. Maybe they've disappointed you, let you down. Feelings towards them are quite negative. Ask God to help you not to love with sentiments and emotion, but like him, with faithfulness and deeds. And notice in that verse that God calls Israel my son. Right from the beginning, God's people are to relate to him as their father. That's really important, isn't it? Husband and wife imagery of this book has kind of faded away, and now we see a father with his son. God's adopting the nation to be his own. But the picture, if you read on, gets even more vivid. The color is turned up as God explains what it means for him to be father. Verse 3, it was I who taught Ephraim to walk, taking them by the arms, but they did not realize it was I who healed them. Have a look after the service, look around, and what will you see? You'll see fathers stooping down to take their toddler by the arms and lift them up as they wobble and totter. They're watching them. They're cheering them on as they manage a few steps. They're rushing forward to grab them before they hit the ground. You see how tender the relationship is. I took them by the arms and helped them to walk. Verse 4, I led them with cords of human kindness, with ties of love. You've been to the playground, haven't you? And you've seen the little toddler there. And what's the toddler got on? Apparently reins. I call it a rope. And why is it there? To frustrate the child? Well, it certainly does. But it actually is a sign of affection and love. I, the parent, am roped to that child. Not to any of the others. I don't care if they wander off and disappear. But that one's mine. And I'll look after him or her. I won't let you go. God's speaking to his people Israel. Do you remember what it was like when you were a child? Do you remember me teaching you to walk, how I led you, how I guided you? I tied you to myself. Friends, is that portrait of God your view of him? Is he that tender? Verse 4, to them I was like one who lifts a little child to the cheek, and I bent down to feed them. It cannot get any closer than that. He lifts us in his arms. He presses his cheek to ours. Isn't that lovely? He feeds us. And as you read on through the Bible, you see that God comes close to us in the person of his son, Jesus. If you're someone who's put their faith in Jesus, you become part of God's family. You call him Father, and he takes you by the arms and he helps you to tie himself to you with cords of love. That's who he is. God does not want to keep you at arm's length. He is not distant. His love is intimate. It's close. It's personal. Is that your picture of God? Or is your God more distant? Perhaps he makes demands of you. He shakes his head when you fall over. The God who tuts when you make a mistake. Listen, whoever that God is, he's not the God of Hosea 11. He's a distortion. Our God is there to catch and hold us as we stagger and struggle. He's a tender Father. But secondly, he's a grieved Father. The God who mourns our unfaithfulness. Look at verse 2. We skipped over it, didn't we? But the more they were called, this is the people, Israel, the more they were called, the more they went away from me. They sacrificed to the Baals. They burned incense to images. Can you hear the pain there? Let that chip away at your view of God. He is not a distant force. He's a father who can be hurt. And there are some fathers who know what that feels like. This morning, there's a father who's grieving. Israel, the son he loves, has walked away. Now, if God were abusive, or if he was negligent, you could understand that, couldn't you? But God has loved them and taught them. He's healed them and led them. He stooped down to feed them, and still they walk away. There was a lady in a previous church who had a foster daughter who was profoundly disabled. And at the time, I think her daughter was about 12, but this lady did everything for her, everything. Before the council changed her house, she would pick this girl up and carry her upstairs every night and carry her down in the morning. She bathed her, she toileted her every day, she fed her. And when she brought her to church, it was so obvious how much she loved this girl. She'd talk about her to anyone who would listen. You could see the pride in her face. It was beautiful. Imagine one day, after the girl had grown up, imagine she turned to her mother and said, "You never loved me. You never cared for me. I'm leaving. I'm going to go somewhere else where people will truly love me." You imagine that. How would that mother feel? You're getting just the tiniest bit of what it feels like to be our God. We've surrounded him with lies and deceit. He's not like that. That's what Israel did. So verse 5 and 6, God gives them what they want. They'll go back to slavery. You want to walk away? Okay. Back to Egypt, back to Assyria. Why? They've forgotten who God is. And so verse 7, my people, he says, are determined to turn from me, to walk away. When we talk about sin, we often think about it as something that's horizontal, don't we? What do I mean by that? It's the hurtful or negligent things that I do to other people in this world. And so there's a flip side to that. I think as long as I'm not hurting anyone else, I'm not sinning. But I wonder if we can see here that sin is also vertical. Actually, the heart of sin is how we relate to God. I don't expect you remember maybe the story of Joseph in the Bible. I mean, you've seen the musical probably. Joseph of the multicolored coat fame. He's tempted at one point in his life to sexual sin. He's tempted to sleep with a woman who's not his wife. But he stops himself and he says two things. First of all, he says, how could I do this to my master who trusts me? See, there's the horizontal. But then he ends by saying, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? One of the reasons why we often sin and give in to temptation again and again is we forget that it is God who's grieved when we walk away from him. We think he's not bothered. We think he doesn't see, doesn't mind. That is not true. Hosea 11, God shows us that he is as much grieved by our sin. The more I called out to them, the more they went away from me. Can you feel that? Come back, Israel, turning the back. Look, this week, when you and I are tempted to turn away from God, think about him. Get that right view of God into your mind, and it'll help. Who are you walking away from? Who are you choosing to be unfaithful to disobey? It's the God who loves you with an everlasting love. Think about the grief that you're causing his heart. A tender father, a grieved father, finally a compassionate father. He is the God who never lets us go. Have a look at verse 8. How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I treat you like Admah? How can I make you like Zeboim? My heart is changed within me and all my compassion is aroused. Here's the note of grace in our riff. God has just said, hasn't he, I will punish my people because they go astray. And then immediately we get this, how can I give you up? You can feel the tension in God's heart, can't you? Now, how does that get resolved? How can we put verses 5 to 7 that call for God's righteous judgment on his people who have betrayed him together with verses 8 and 9? And by the way, Admah and Zeboim, they're two places that were destroyed in the time of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so God is saying, how can I do that to my people, to the people I've promised to love? I think it's tempting to look at these verses and think, God's just emotionally weak. You know, it's like me with my kids. If you do, I'm going to punish you. And then the next minute, oh, well, all right. You can have the iPad again. Now remember verse 9. What does it say? I'm a God. I'm not a man. I'm not like you. I'm the Holy One. He doesn't love like we do. He's not emotionally weak. He's covenantally strong. Do you remember that covenant? The whole point of Hosea is that he's made a covenant with his people, and nothing, not even their sin, can break that. But we have to wait for 700 years to see how he keeps his covenant of love. Jesus Christ was born, and he would rewalk this path of Israel. He would come out of Egypt, where he was hiding in exile. He would go into the wilderness and be tested. But where Israel messed up, where she was the rebellious son, Jesus was the true Son of God who never turned away from his Father. He set his face to Jerusalem, walked towards the cross. And do you remember he wrestled in the garden on the night before he died? And we hear him saying, Father, please take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done. But what does the Father say to the Son in the garden? Well, Hosea 11:8 tells us. How can I give you up, Jesus? How can I hand you over, my son? How can I treat you like Admah, make you like Zeboim? The answer is, I can't, but I will, because I've made a covenant of love with my people. I have tied myself to them with cords of love, and I will not leave them. And so the Father lets his Son go to the cross and take on himself the sin of the world. And the faithful Son takes the judgment that we deserve for our unfaithfulness, so that we might be the faithful people of God. It's in the cross that we see God's justice and mercy combined, where we see this wonderful divine swap. His righteousness for our sin, his wholeness for our brokenness. That is what our God is like. And so this passage ends with the roar of a lion. Verse 10 says, they, my people, will follow the Lord, and he will roar like a lion. And when he roars, his children will come trembling from the west. They will come from Egypt, trembling like sparrows, from Assyria, fluttering like doves. And I will settle them in their homes, declares the Lord. Hosea 11 is the voice of God roaring at you this morning. Not as Satan does, an enemy prowling around. Do you remember, like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour? No, God roars at us like the tender, grieved, compassionate Father that he is. He's roaring at our false, grotesque visions of him. He's roaring at the lies and deceit that we surround him with. And he's calling us, his children, back to him. He's talking about the Jewish exiles here returning from their spiritual Egypt, from Assyria where they've been settled. But he's also talking about us, who maybe have wandered away from him. Us who doubted his love and compassion, his tenderness and kindness. And he's saying to us, I love you. I gave my one and only Son for you so that you would come back to me. Will you do that? Perhaps you remember we were looking at this a few weeks ago, and I said there are various kind of words in Hosea that alert you to grace, right? To God's goodness and kindness. Words like seek and return, but there was another one, and that's trembling. And it's an unusual word, isn't it? When you tremble, you're afraid. And we should tremble before God. We should fear God. The picture that he's painted of himself should be so powerful in our minds and hearts. It should be so holy and awesome that we would never dare to run away from him, but always run towards him. Fearing God for the Christian is not like kind of cringing in terror before a lion. It is the fear that we should ever want to walk away from somebody who's so good and kind and perfect and loving. It is a heart that is broken by our sin, that knows there's only destruction away for him and longs to return, trembling before the God who loves me. How we should fear to leave the Lord. Just thinking this week how easy it is to do that. To go hours, days, not thinking about him, not caring about him, not considering what he wants. No, let's tremble in his presence, that he would graciously forgive all our sins and make us an everlasting home with him. Let's tremble, in other words, at the mighty love that God has for each one of us in Jesus Christ, his Son. I would invite the band to come up. As they do, I've just got some questions here. Just in the quietness, think these over. How has Hosea 11 shown your faulty view of God? Where have you painted a wrong portrait of him? As you get a kind of a right view, does that help you to stop wandering away from him? And what's it going to mean for you this morning to return? Maybe you're a follower of Jesus and you've just been wandering away. What's it going to mean to come back? Maybe you've never returned. You've never followed Jesus Christ. What a great opportunity to do it this morning. Just going to give us a moment. I'm going to pray, then the band sing. We'll stand together. But let's just take a moment to talk to our God.